Hi, I'm Mark Weidemeyer. I'm a professor of economics and finance at Chapman University, and I'm here to discuss the CMC Lowe Los Angeles County Consumer Sentiment Index. What is a consumer sentiment index? A consumer sentiment index is a measure of expectations regarding future consumption. And consumption constitutes approximately 70% of U.S. economic activity. And that is also true of the County of Los Angeles. Given consumption's importance in the U.S. economy, there are consumer sentiment indices for the United States. Two of the most famous ones are one done by the University of Michigan and one done by the Conference Board. There are also some state-level measures of consumer sentiment. However, we are unaware of any consumer sentiment surveys for any major cities or major metropolitan areas in the United States. And so what the Lowe Institute of Political Economy at Claremont McKenna College and Chapman University have done is they've partnered together to help bring the Consumer Sentiment Index to Los Angeles County. Los Angeles is the second largest city in the United States. And by constructing a Consumer Sentiment Index for Los Angeles, we have an opportunity to provide the local residents and government leaders with important information about future economic activity in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Consumer Sentiment Index is comprised by 7 questions. So what I'd like to briefly do is go through these 7 questions. Question 1. Do you think that a year from now, you and your family will be better off financially, worse off financially, or about the same financially? Question 2. Do you think that business conditions in the United States during the next year will be better, worse, or about the same? Question 3. During your last few months, have business conditions in Los Angeles improved your economic situation, worsened your economic situation, or had no effect on your economic situation? Question 4. Are current business conditions in Los Angeles better than a year ago, worse than a year ago, or the same as a year ago? Question 5. A year from now, do you expect that overall business conditions in the United States will improve your family's economic situation, worsen your family's economic situation, or allow your family's economic situation to remain the same? Question 6. Complete the following statement. Compared to today, if you lost your job within the next year, you would think you would have a better chance, a worse chance, or about the same chance at finding a new job. And finally, question 7 is a question that's very commonly asked in measures of consumer sentiment. Do you think the next year will be a good time to buy an automobile or a bad time to buy an automobile? So if you paid close attention, you notice that for the first 6 questions, with the exception of the last one, the car question, each question has a positive response, a neutral response, and a negative response. And we're going to use the positive, neutral, and negative responses to construct a consumer sentiment index for Los Angeles County. So I'd like to talk a few minutes about how is a consumer sentiment index constructed. Well, first, we calculate the fraction of positive responses to each question. Okay, so we have a random survey of about 500. So we're looking at the fraction of those 500 surveys which have positive responses. Number 2, we calculate the fraction of negative responses for each question. Okay. Then we compute the difference between the positive and negative responses. Then we add 1 to the difference between the positive and negative responses. We then sum up the value of the indices constructed from the 7 questions. Then divide by the value of the base index, which is the second quarter of 2015. And then we multiply by 100. And so what this means is that in our base quarter, the second quarter of 2015, the Los Angeles Consumer Sentiment Index will take a value of 100. So all subsequent quarters will be compared relative to the second quarter of 2015. So here we have a graph of the Consumer Sentiment Index that shows all the data that we have from the survey. The data, as I mentioned earlier, started in the second quarter of 2015. We can see that it rises and peaks at a value of about 120 in the third quarter of 2016, and then since then it has fallen, and it's fallen below a level of 95. What I'd like to do now is dig a little bit deeper into the 7 underlying questions of the Consumer Sentiment Index. And if you look at these 7 questions, there's 3 that really stick out in the last quarter of having changed. And those are questions 3, 5, and 7. Question 3 is a question about business conditions in Los Angeles. Question 5 is a question about business conditions in the United States. And question 7 is a car question. Questions 3 and 5 went down by approximately more than 5%, indicating that people see that business conditions in both Los Angeles and in the United States as a whole, sentiment regarding business conditions has declined. And question 7 is the car question. And we see a 7.3% decline in the car question from the third to fourth quarter of 2017. Now, what I'd like to do is move forward and highlight some key findings from our demographic breakdowns. And sort of the key thing from the age summary is that for groups 55 to 64 and 65 and higher, we see a big rise in consumer sentiment. Okay, these groups represent approximately 18% of the sample, and we believe that this reflects the boom in the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average increased approximately 25% in 2017, and for people who are near retirement or retired, their well-being, their economic well-being is closely tied to their pensions or their 403B plans or retirement plans, and these retirement plans depend very heavily on the stock market, and so their consumer sentiment has gone up. We also see consumer sentiment has declined for some younger groups and for the 45 to 54 group. This may in part reflect some concerns these groups may have about finding better jobs and higher wage growth. Now, if I switch to gender, we see that there were modest declines in both men and women between the third and fourth quarters of 2017. If we look at ethnicity, we see that the largest decline is seen by African Americans. It's a nearly 10% decline, a minus 9.5% decline between the third and fourth quarters of 2017. And this may possibly reflect some racial tensions that may affect the future consumer sentiment by African Americans. If we move towards income, okay, we see a large decline with lower income groups. And we also see a large increase in the income group between 100 and 150,000. These declines may reflect, in some cases, uncertainty regarding the tax reform. The federal government recently passed a tax reform bill. The tax reform bill calls for some changes to the tax code. And for California, it's sort of interesting. On the one hand, the tax code there are some tax breaks in the short run for middle-class families. There's also tax breaks for some wealthy individuals and tax breaks for corporations. But on the other side, there are limitations to deductibility of interest mortgage and also the ability to deduct local and state taxes off your federal taxes. So it's a little bit unclear how all this is going to play out, but certainly the change in the tax code has brought some uncertainty and may help to account for some of the declines among these groups. If we look at education, basically most of these changes are relatively flat except for graduates from college. This may reflect the idea that some people in these groups feel that they're underemployed and could in fact be getting better jobs, but they're not getting these better jobs, and wage growth has been relatively slow over the past few years. And again, if we look at full-time employed, there's a decline of about 10%. full-time employed, again, this may reflect some uncertainty regarding the tax reform bill and how exactly this impacts corporations and the individuals that work for them. And we have our marital. We don't really have big numbers here. If I move forward to our conclusion. So what do we conclude from this? Well, the index had a little bit about a 3% decline between the third and fourth quarters of 2017. The index still remains in the 90s, which is typically consistent with slow but steady growth in the area. But we believe that this sort of small decline in the consumer sentiment index may largely reflect uncertainty regarding the tax reform bill that was just recently passed in Washington. And we look forward to seeing if there's any changes in consumer sentiment after we see the tax withholdings going down and people having higher take-home pay over the next couple of quarters following the implementation of the tax reform bill in 2018. Thank you.